Chapter 5. Contours. With Manchester now a fair few miles behind him, the man climbed steadily into the Peak District, his boots crunching against the gravel of winding roads and the occasional uneven trail. The ascent grew steeper with every step, and the cold air bit at his face, carried by a wind that had howled all morning. He pressed onward despite the turn in the weather. The mist rolled in as if waiting for his arrival, creeping across the landscape and swallowing the hills in its opaque embrace. It clung to his clothes and dampened his skin, obscuring the view he had hoped to take in from the heights. Frustration gnawed at him. Just hours earlier, the day had been clear, with gusts of wind sweeping through the valleys and ridges. But British weather was mercurial, capable of turning in an instant, and he knew better than to expect consistency. Pressing on into the highlands, the man could hear the sound of rushing water growing louder with each step. As he reached the top of a false summit along the road, he finally saw the source of the noise. Ahead, a reservoir dam came into view, the water spilling over in chaotic torrents. The recent heavy rain and lack of maintenance had turned the once controlled flow into a frantic surge. The sight was both reassuring, confirming he was on the right path, and a reminder to stay hydrated as he pressed on. He took a long, deliberate sip from the straw of his water bladder, feeling the cool liquid flow steadily into his mouth. He was careful not to drink too much, always mindful of not letting his supply dip too low. Over the years, he'd learned the hard way to never run the risk of running dry. Pulling the straw from his mouth, he surveyed his surroundings. He was in the right place to top up, and that thought eased the tension in his chest. He continued up the road, each step pressing him higher into the hills. The climb was steady, but the ground beneath his boots grew rougher, the incline more pronounced. As he crested the next rise, the full view of the reservoir spread out before him. The large body of water lay still, sheltered by the valley and protected from the wind. From where he stood, he could see the full expanse of the reservoir, the far side barely visible in the distance, separated by a long stretch of rugged terrain. It would take time to reach it. He had no illusions about the distance ahead. The journey to the far shore would be long, but it was just another part of the path he had to cross. About halfway along the reservoir, the road curved gently, bringing him closer to water level. The air felt cooler here, the stillness of the valley amplifying the faint ripple of the water against the shore. As he rounded the bend, a small wooded area came into view at the water's edge. The trees formed a natural canopy, their dense branches providing a sheltered, quiet space. He paused for a moment, observing the spot. It was ideal, calm, hidden, and close enough to the reservoir to refill his water supply. A good place to stop for lunch, he thought, as his stomach began to remind him how long it had been since his last meal. He stepped off the road and made his way down a short, uneven path to the wooded area. The soft crunch of gravel beneath his boots gave way to damp soil as he approached the clearing by the water's edge. A large, flat-topped rock stood out among the trees, its surface smooth and inviting. It made the perfect seat. He slid his pack from his shoulders and set it down beside the rock. Unzipping a front pocket, he pulled out an empty plastic bottle and a compact water filter, placing them neatly on the ground. Reaching into his pack again, he retrieved his water bladder, giving it a quick shake. The slosh of liquid inside confirmed it was about 3/4 full, enough for now, but not something he'd let dwindle further. The reservoir water, lay just beyond the trees, calm and clear. He glanced at the sheltered spot, its quiet serenity a welcome change from the barren stretches of road. The moment to refill and gather his strength felt well earned. Grabbing the filter and bottle, he walked to the water's edge. The still, reflective surface stretched before him, serene and undisturbed. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of peace in the quiet. He scanned the water carefully, his eyes moving over the surface and along the shoreline, searching for any signs of contamination, oil slicks, debris, or worse, floating bodies. But there was nothing. The water was clear, and the surroundings were still. Walking to the water's edge until his boots just touched the surface, he lowered himself into a squat and leaned forward to fill the bottle. As he dipped it into the reservoir, a bubbling sound accompanied the rising water, sending out perfect, concentric ripples across the mirrored surface. Satisfied, he stood and made his way back to the rock. Sitting down, he screwed the filter onto the bottle and began the steady process of refilling his water bladder. Once the bladder was full, he sealed it tightly and packed it away. Keeping his arm in the bag, he rummaged until he pulled out a camping food pouch labeled chicken stew and a lightweight fork. Though it was meant to be heated, he peeled it open and dug in cold. To his relief, the flavor was surprisingly good, the hearty, seasoned stew lifting his spirits with each bite. Between mouthfuls, he paused to squeeze the remaining water from the bottle through the filter, taking refreshing sips. The combination of food and drink, though simple, offered a brief and much-needed boost of the man's mood. Fed and hydrated, he packed his belongings back into the bag and retrieved a pre-rolled cigarette and lighter from a side pocket. He sparked it to life and took a long draw, the tension in his shoulders easing with each pull. As he smoked, he stared blankly at the still water, his thoughts drifting aimlessly, carried by the quiet calm of the scene. Drag after drag, the cigarette burned down, the act giving him a brief reprieve from the day's effort. When only the filter remained, he stubbed it out and readied himself to move on. With a quiet gasp of realization, he froze, then tugged up his sleeve to check his watch. The hands read 12:30. By his estimate, it had been roughly 24 hours since his close encounter with the sick. The next 24 hours would be critical. If he was infected, symptoms would begin to show soon. Closing his eyes, he took a deep breath and focused inward, listening intently to his body. Everything felt normal for now. No fever, no aches, no ominous signs of illness. But tomorrow would tell him if he was lucky enough to escape unscathed or unlucky enough to join the doomed. The man shook his head, refusing to dwell on it any longer. With a deep breath, he turned his gaze back to the road stretching ahead. The worn tarmac wound its way into the distance, disappearing into the rising hills. Adjusting his pack, he took a moment to stretch his shoulders before setting off again. As his boots struck the gravel, he felt a familiar discomfort creeping in. The stiff leather, fresh from the camping store where he'd spent the night, hadn't yet molded to his feet. Each step brought a slight sting, the early warning of blisters forming. He gritted his teeth and continued for a few more paces before stopping with a frustrated sigh. Easing himself onto a nearby rock, he shrugged off his pack and reached inside for his small first aid kit. Pulling off his boots and peeling back his socks, he winced at the reddened skin on his heels. With careful hands, he applied plasters to the sore spots, layering them securely before slipping his socks and boots back on. Standing again, he flexed his feet, testing the makeshift fix, and then hoisted his pack onto his shoulders. Without another pause, he pressed on, determined to keep moving. He made his way back to the road with an air of haste to return to the journey. his boots scuffing lightly against the tarmac as he started up the path. Just as he settled into his stride, a faint sound reached his ears. A cough, distant and hollow, echoing through the hills. He froze in his tracks, the hair on the back of his neck rising. Slowly, he turned, his gaze locking on the stretch of road behind him. He stared intently, scanning the empty expanse, trying to pinpoint the source. The silence that followed felt heavy, pressing against his ears. There was nothing else, no movement, no sound. His chest tightened as doubt crept in. Had he really heard it? Or was his mind playing tricks on him, warped by the fear of infection gnawing at his thoughts? Shaking his head, he muttered under his breath and turned back to the path ahead, forcing himself to press on, though the uneasy feeling lingered like a shadow. Leaving his unsteady thoughts behind, he pressed on along the road, which began to veer away from the reservoir as it curved toward its far banks. Stopping to check his map, he tried to get his bearings. He looked down the road, back toward the reservoir, and then up toward the mist-shrouded fell tops. "You'd think after all these years I'd be able to read a bloody map, for God's sake," he said aloud, his voice breaking the stillness. Walking another 50 meters, he stopped again, his eyes fixing on a footpath branching off the road and climbing steeply into the hills. With a blank expression, he stood for a few seconds, staring at the path ahead. "What a dickhead," he said, shaking his head as he folded the map and stuffed it away. Without another pause, he began the climb, the steep incline immediately biting at his legs. With a steady pace, the man ascended, his movements displaying practiced experience. His deep breaths synchronized with his steps, creating an almost rhythmic march. Higher and higher, he climbed into the mist, only slowing to navigate boulders and uneven terrain. By now, it was clear he had entered a machine-like meditative state, intent on putting the climb behind him as efficiently as possible. Roughly 400 feet up, he reached what he had assumed would be a false summit and found his prediction correct. The path ahead began to level out, stretching off into the mist. Taking a moment to catch his breath, he leaned back against a rock and looked down into the shrouded valley and path which he had ascended. As his pulse steadied, his breathing began to slow and quiet, the rhythmic heaving of the climb giving way to a calm stillness. He rested against the rock, gazing absently down at the obscured path he had conquered. Then, his hair stood on end. For the briefest moment, he thought he saw movement, a faint flicker in the mist far below. He froze, every muscle tensing as his eyes locked onto the spot. He stared intently, unblinking, willing whatever it was to reveal itself. The seconds dragged on, but the path remained eerily still. Pushing himself off the rock, he stepped closer to the edge, his gaze fixed on the spot. "Hello? Is someone there?" he called out, his voice cutting through the muffled quiet of the misty hills. Silence answered him. He lingered, waiting, scanning the shrouded landscape for any sign of life. After a long, tense minute, he exhaled sharply, turned on his heel, and resumed his climb. A concerned expression hardened his face, his pace quickening as he pressed onward, leaving the unsettling moment behind. Now, over the brow and across the saddle of the fell, the path stretched across the wind-swept tops of the Peak District. Open again to the elements, the man braced himself against a brutal wind that fought his every step, forcing him to lean into its resistance. Still, he marched on with an unsettled urgency that he couldn't quite shake. Was he starting to lose his grip, his mind fraying under the weight of sickness? Or had there truly been something in the mist? Perhaps it was just a sheep, innocently grazing where he couldn't see. Or maybe his long solitude was beginning to take its toll, conjuring ghosts from the shadows of this desolate, shrouded landscape. The wind howled through the barren heights as if mocking his thoughts, tugging at his clothes and scraping against his exposed skin. His eyes scanned the path ahead, but his mind lingered on the questions behind him, their presence gnawing like an itch he couldn't scratch. Still, he pressed forward, letting the raw wind steal his doubts and carry them into the endless grey. The exposed, relentless rolling peaks stretched out like a desert of heather and stone, the harsh weather amplifying their emptiness. The wind roared without pause, tugging at him, and the uneven ground beneath his boots made every step an effort. What must have been 20 minutes of walking felt stretched into an hour, each moment dragging under the weight of the conditions. The path ahead began to decline, winding gently downward as the mist thinned, revealing a valley below. Cradled by the rugged peaks, it held a small town, its clustered rooftops and winding streets offering a faint promise of shelter and rest. The man paused, his breath clouding in the biting wind, and allowed himself a brief moment to take in the sight. The goal of the day was within reach, and the pull of that thought spurred him onward, down into the valley. Making his way down the winding dirt path, the man passed through a weathered wooden gate with a faded public footpath sign nailed to its frame. Beyond it, the trail descended into a small neighborhood of stone houses, their sturdy, time-worn facades perfectly suited to the rugged terrain of the region. The homes, scattered yet orderly, seemed as much a part of the landscape as the heather-covered peaks above. After a short walk, he emerged onto a main road, pausing to pull out his map. Towns and cities were ripe with opportunities for wrong turns, and he wasn't about to waste time retracing his steps. As he studied the creased page, he nodded and murmured, "Hello, Marsden. Long time no see. Shame we couldn't meet under better circumstances." The words were spoken softly, not to anyone in particular, but as a brief acknowledgement of the village he had arrived in, a habit formed by long days of solitude. With the map still in hand, he started up the street, his steps deliberate and careful. The familiar unease of entering a settlement crept in. No matter how peaceful a place appeared, towns and cities in this world demanded a level of caution that could not be ignored. The man moved cautiously through Marsden, stopping at each street corner to listen and look for any sign of life. The town was dead silent, just like the others he'd passed through, though the stillness here felt heavier. He walked through the market square and spotted a wooden notice board. The main sheet caught his attention. Martial law enforced lockdown. Below, it listed rules for leaving the home, only for food and water. Other notices described mandatory decontamination procedures. One notice, detailing symptoms of infection, cough, fever, fatigue, stopped him in his tracks. His heart skipped a beat as the memories flooded back. The coughing he had heard on the trail, the chilling thought that had gripped him when he realized how close he'd come to the sick. He quickly rolled up his sleeve and checked his arm. There was nothing, no visible signs of infection, but the memory lingered. The panic he'd felt earlier clawed at him again, the uncertainty of whether he was still in the clear. Shaking off the thought, he turned away from the board and continued on, pushing the fear down as best he could. He continued along the main road, leaving the confines of the town behind. The dark windows of the houses seemed to stare back at him, each one feeling like a pair of eyes watching his every move. His feet were sore from the miles already covered, but the new boots didn't slow him down. He wasn't hesitant. If anything, He was determined to keep moving, despite the discomfort. He'd covered plenty of distance today, but rest was still a luxury he needed to find. His search led him out of town, and before long, a long driveway came into view, branching off from the main road. At the end of the drive, nestled between a small outcrop of trees, stood a cottage. It was tucked away, quiet and private, an ideal place to stop. He stared at it for a moment, his mind weighing the prospect of rest. Approaching the cottage cautiously, boots scuffing softly against the overgrown tarmac of the driveway, the man neared the door. The house was eerily quiet, its small windows coated with a matte green grime, the result of years of neglect, offering no clue as to what might lie within. Reaching for the handle, he gave it a firm turn, locked, as expected. He swung his pack off his shoulder and rummaged through a side pocket, pulling out a small but sturdy jimmy bar. Kneeling slightly, he worked it into the edge of the doorframe. It took some effort, the wood groaning in resistance, but with a sharp twist and a loud pop, the lock gave way. Pausing to listen to the silence that followed, he slowly pushed the door open. The faint creak of hinges echoed into the stillness as he stepped inside. The air was stale but bearable, and the dim interior hinted at a space long unused. Letting the door close behind him, he stood for a moment, adjusting to the shadows before venturing further in. The sun had set, leaving the hills under a sky full of stars, with the last traces of daylight fading on the horizon. Inside the cottage, the man had settled in. It was in good condition, despite a thin layer of dust on the furniture and shelves, and he'd spent time securing the door with planks of wood and nails, ensuring it was as safe as he could make it. A fire crackled steadily in the hearth, its warmth filling the room. The man sat in an armchair near the fireplace, sipping whiskey from a clean glass he'd found in the kitchen and taking slow drags from a cigarette. The remnants of his meal, an assortment of tinned foods, sat on the nearby table, the simple act of eating providing a small comfort. Leaning back, he murmured, "I could get used to this. I'll check the route later. Need to unwind first." He picked up a book from a dusty shelf and began reading, letting the words pull him in. The fire popped now and then as he turned the pages, the cottage quiet, except for the occasional crackle. Outside, the night deepened, and for a short while, the world's troubles felt far away. As the fire faded, the man's eyes drifted in and out of sleep. A noise? The gate. Jolting up from his chair, he reached for his pistol in his bag, holding it at the ready, partially covered. He stayed still, waiting and listening. The sound was faint at first, but then a subtle thump, something against the window near the door. His blood ran cold. Slowly, he turned his gaze toward the window. As the reality of the sight hit him, his heart hammered. A gaunt, pale face, with bloodshot eyes staring back at him, hollow and unblinking.